Hi, BCC Growth Groups. It's such a pleasure to be with you today. I hope your studies are going well so far. I just want to give you a brief recap of our sermon from Sunday, where we were talking about the seventh commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. This is something that I think all of us kind of know is probably a good commandment, but it's something that if you watch our world, and even if you watch the church, you see it's something we struggle with. Broken marriages, distrust and cheating in relationships really are everywhere. And we have been wrestling a little bit this past week about what can we do about it. And the story we looked at was the story of Jacob and Esau, which isn't outright a story about adultery, but it's a story about a foolish decision that looked to satisfy an appetite, an instant gratification, if you will, at the sacrifice of a long-term blessing. If you remember the story, Esau comes in from the field and he sells his birthright to his brother Jacob in exchange for a pot of red stew. And Esau gobbles up the stew, and then afterwards we find out that it was actually lentil stew. It wasn't even good meat stew. It wasn't even hearty. What he was hoping for ended up being a disappointment. But in the process, he sacrificed something of far greater value. So often, I think many of us in our relationships, we choose a path of least resistance. We look to fulfill our appetite at the expense of a long-term blessing. And the implications of this are real. The God-given blessing of marriage deteriorates. Our families see it, and the rippling effects touches not just us and our spouse, but those around us, our kids and our family. So we talked about, well, what can we do about this? We looked at Andy Stanley's idea that maybe we need to set up some guardrails in our life. Kind of where we are, what we watch and consume, how we talk about this with our spouses, how we engage in regular, healthy sexual practices so that we can avoid falling into the ditch by kind of, when we get to points where we're having struggle, we glance against the guardrail and are able to correct without ending in catastrophe. But we also talked about, what about for those of us who have experienced this pain in our relationships, those of us maybe who have been caught in adultery or participated in this kind of really crippling sin, or those of us who have been victims of it. What can we do? And we looked at the story in John 4 where the woman, And we looked at the story in John chapter 4 where the Samaritan woman comes to the well and Jesus has this conversation with her. And she's talking about water in the temporal sense. She wants to fulfill her instant gratification. She thinks Jesus is talking about the same thing. I just want something that'll make me not thirsty anymore. Just like Esau wanted something, I want something that's going to make me not hungry anymore. But Jesus offers her something different. He offers her a living water that brings healing and wholeness. One, he says that you'll never thirst again. And then she says, will you give me that water? And Jesus, he returns the question to her, all right, why don't you go fetch your husband? She said, I don't have a husband. In fact, Jesus responds, I know you've had 5, and the man you're living with now is not your husband. You've been thirsty a lot. You've come to the well many times. But what I offer you is something different. For those of us who have been hurt by adulterous relationships, those of us who have seen the wreckage of this, those of us maybe who are even caught in these kind of addictions now of lust and pornography or adulterous relationships, I encourage you to consider the story at the woman at the well, that we don't need to, it's not about getting the moral behavior right first and then later fixing the relationship and then later right relationship with God, but Jesus flipped the paradigm on his head. Start with relationship with Christ, and from that all things will live up into living water, will well up into living water from which we will never thirst again. If we get it right with him, then we can get the rest of these relationships right. Then it's not a moral code of conduct. It's taking back the birthright, to use the words from Esau. It's taking back the blessing that God has given us, the blessing of marriage, the blessing of sex, the blessing of right relationship. BCC, we need to do a better job at this because the church and the world around us are crumbling because of moral failure. But if we can get this right, we can be an example of what it means to be a people of living water. God bless, and I pray you have a great growth group today.